Sunnyside Cemetery overlooks the rich farmland of Abby's Prairie, where many of the cemetery residents were born, lived, and died. Sunnyside provides them a peaceful and beautiful final resting place. This film is dedicated to Roger Sherman, his family of pioneers, and their descendants, past and present. Hard work and dedication to Sunnyside Cemetery, as well as love for their heritage and Whidbey Island history, have played a huge role in preserving this cultural treasure.
In April of 1792, British explorer Captain George Vancouver, commanding His Majesty's ship Discovery, sailed into the Straits of Juan de Fuca. He would soon name every island, waterway, mountain, and point of land he could see. On this voyage, Vancouver's sailing master, his navigator, discovered and named Deception Pass, proving the adjacent landmass to be an island, Puget Sound's largest island, an island Vancouver named after its discoverer, Joseph Whidbey.
Good land for cultivations is abundant on this island. I've taken my claim on it, and now I'm living on the same. If Rebecca, the children, and you all were here, I think I could live and die here content. Isaac Eby, in a letter to his brother Winfield, 1851.
The Donation Land Act of 1850 brought Isaac Eby to Whidbey Island, where he became the island's first permanent settler.
It was set up by Congress so that anyone that came and permanently settled on the land, built a cabin, lived here so long, they could claim 320 acres for free, which was a fabulous deal.
Eby and his wife Rebecca together claimed a 640-acre parcel. The land they claimed was prairie, natural grassland, rich farmland ready to plant, which to this day is known as Eby's Prairie.
Isaac Eby claimed that land in 1850. It was 640 acres. It was 1 square mile. And it was the only donation land claim in the area that did not lay north and south. It was taken so that they got the best prairie land. They didn't want to clear the big trees off of the lands.
The early 1850s saw new settlers arriving, fully involved building homes, cabins, and barns, planting orchards, food gardens, harvesting timber, and sawing lumber. 1853 saw the founding of Coupeville, one of the oldest towns in what would become Washington State. Founded by Captain Thomas Coupe and his wife Maria. Coupe is also justifiably well known for being the only person ever to sail a full-rigged sailing ship through perilous Deception Pass. Coupe was also sailing master on Puget Sound's first revenue cutter, the Jefferson Davis. But some settlers, like Rebecca Eby, didn't thrive. Loneliness with her husband frequently away on extended government business to Olympia, the constant struggle to win a living from the land, fear of raiding bands of Tlinkits or Haidas from the north, and her own fragility all conspired to wear her away.
She was not a healthy woman, died of tuberculosis, and she was 30 years old, had 3 children, and it was just a tragedy.
Saturday, May 21st. Mrs. Doyle is ironing. I am very lean and feel sometimes like my stay on this earth will not be very long. But the will of the Lord be done in all things. I will leave all I hold dear here into His special care. Oh, may He watch over them and protect them. Rebecca Eby, 1853.
They had a comfortable home back east. They came from Illinois. And then the husband would come out. He was going to be the big explorer, and they were going to get all this land, and they were going to be rich and all the rest of it. And then the women didn't have much choice. They had to join them, and so they did. And Rebecca, she had a child while she was here, and she was just plain a sick woman. Her daughter was called Hetty, and Hetty lived to be 7 years old. And so many people died from consumption. Now we know it as tuberculosis. But it took so many of our children at that time.
The Columbian, 29 October 1853. Mrs. Rebecca Eby, wife of Colonel Isaac Eby, resident of Whidbey Island, Washington Territory, on 29 September 1853, died of consumption. Mrs. Eby was from Schuyler County, Missouri. She crossed the plains in 1851 to rejoin her husband in Oregon and was the first white woman that settled on the island. She has left a husband and 3 children to mourn the loss of a companion and mother, and her death has occasioned a void in the community which will long be felt and regretted.
In 1856, a tribe of northern Indians came down, and that was their custom. These northern Indians were mean, warfaring nations, and they came down every summer to take what they wanted from this area, mainly slaves. And so they came down in 1856, and they managed to kill a white man. And so our government took a warship, a Navy ship, and they went down to the encampment of the northern Indians. It was the Cake Indians. And they wanted them to surrender and be tried under the white man's law. And they said no. And so they shelled the village, killed several Indians, including a chief. So the Cake tribe went back to Alaska. And that winter, they decided that they needed to take revenge. A chief for a chief, or a Tyee for a Tyee. And they did.
Mother and we 4 girls made a visit to the Crockett family sometime in 1856. It was during the Indian War. While we were all bathing in the Sound off Whidbey Island, an immense canoe filled with northern Indians in war dress suddenly swung around a point of land in the cove where we were bathing. At sight of these Indians, my mother realized that as the wife and family of the governor of Washington Territory, we might prove to be invaluable as hostages. Realizing this, we started at once for the Crockett home, which we reached shortly. Mrs. Kate Stevens Bates, daughter of Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens.
It was just after dark at the Isaac Eby homestead on a warm, quiet August evening in 1857. Eby, his children, his second wife Emily with her daughter Anna, along with family visitors George and Lucretia Corliss, were aroused.
About 11 o'clock, the dogs outside began barking. Colonel Eby went out to ascertain the cause of the disturbance, and immediately a shot was heard. In a second or two, he appeared at the window at the back of the house and motioned to those within to go outdoors. As he raised his hand in gesticulation, they noticed that one finger was gone. They all ran toward the woods, except Mrs. Corliss, who started up the road toward my house. She knocked loudly at our door and immediately told us what had happened. We took our guns and started back with her. Arriving at the house, we found all silent. The headless body of their victim was lying in the yard. We went down to the beach. Nobody, nothing there. When daylight came, there was not a sign of life on the water as far as the eye could reach, and the cruel murderers had left no track by which they could be traced. William Ballinger Engel.
Isaac Eby was a pivotal figure in the Puget Sound region and indeed Oregon Territory from the time he arrived in the early 1850s until his death. He was someone who was thought to be the next territorial governor. He was acquainted with every organization and major figure in the area. And when he was murdered in 1857, it was one of those events that everyone remembered what they were doing and where they were when they got that news. That's how traumatic it was.
At that time, everybody started building protection, which was the blockhouses. And here in Central Whidbey, we're fortunate to have 4 blockhouses that remain. And these are log structures that were built to repel Indian attacks. And that's out of the original 9. These blockhouses have been refurbished, and we happen to have one in Sunnyside Cemetery. We call it the Davis Blockhouse. It was actually built as a residence, and it's the only blockhouse with a fireplace in it. The blockhouses are an important part of our history, and the nicest one is downtown Coupeville by the Historical Museum.
The Engel family was one of the first families to settle here right after the Ebys, and it was their house that people went to for help the night that Isaac was murdered. W.B. Engel was renowned as a farmer, but probably the more interesting character in that family was Flora Pearson Engel. She not only took care of the lighthouse as a young woman, but she was a writer, and her writings about those people are often the reference point for historians today.
Flora Engel and her husband had several children, and the descendants of those families are still here in Coupeville. And in fact, a portion of them are still farming the same land that her and her husband did.
Okay, my great-grandmother was Flora Augusta Pearson Engel. She was born in New Hampshire in 1850 and came to Whidbey Island in 1866.
She came here as a 14-year-old with her mother. And it was during the period of time when Asa Mercer was recruiting girls from back east. They called them the Mercer girls, and he made 2 trips, and Flora came out on that boat on the second trip.
And Mercer was looking for families, and particularly women, to travel to the Northwest. Because at that time, this area had 9 men for every woman, and they were in desperate need of teachers, cooks, seamstresses, and whatever else a woman could contribute to their household. She never did consider herself to be a Mercer girl. She was only 18 when she arrived here. She had no intention of getting married.
Her dad was a lighthouse keeper at Admiralty Head at Fort Casey, and she was the assistant, and so she did most of the logs and that type of thing. But she's also an attractive young unmarried woman, and so it was said that there were times when there were as many as a dozen horses tied up to the picket fence out there on a Sunday afternoon, and she'd entertain them. She was musical. She could play the piano, and they'd all sing. And so anyway, she finally picked out a bachelor farmer that was here, older than herself, and was married, but it wasn't until she was 25 years old, so she must have been having a good time as a holdout.
The 2 of them were married in May of 1876 up in Victoria, took a honeymoon to San Francisco, and then came back here to live.
He died, I think it was about 30 years before she did, but she became a major part of the community. She was the head of the Ladies of the Round Table. She, when they couldn't afford a minister anymore in the Congregational Church, she became the minister and ran the church. She traveled quite a bit, and remember, this was in the 1930s. And the best part is that she remembered all of that history, and she recorded it, and she wrote articles in the local paper and various things. So she was a very major part of our community.
She was a very staunch member of her church, and so she walked from where they lived in the house there on the corner of Eby Road to the church and walking up the hill. Well, there were no sidewalks, and all too often it would be muddy, and there was a number of times where she actually walked out of her galoshes, and so she got tired of having to put up with this, and so she went across to Camino Island to the lumber mill that was there and talked them out of donating scrap lumber. And then she talked to some of the local sea captains and got them to pick up the lumber and bring it into the dock in Coupeville. And then she twisted the arms of the local farmers. At any time they had taken a load of something down to the dock, would they please bring this lumber out and along the hill. And so finally she got the farmers then to build a sidewalk from Prairie Center to the top of the hill so she could walk to church without having to lose her galoshes or end up with her skirts all muddy.
Winfield Eby died in 1865. He was 33 years old, and he was the first one in this cemetery.
Winfield Eby was the chronicler of the Eby family. His diaries recount their stories and also the history of this place in a way that's quite profound. His last remaining sibling, Mary Eby Bozarth, meets his remains delivered to the beach at Eby's Landing.
She buried him in a corner on their farm, and it was her wish that they could have the family up here because part of the family was already buried down at Eby's Landing. And so anyway, she succeeded eventually. Those bodies down there were exhumed and brought up here. When Mary buried her brother here, she decided that since there was no county cemetery, that this should be it. And so she sold 1 1/4 acres of the corner of their farm to the county for $1. And that was the beginning of Sunnyside Cemetery.
John Coe Kellogg was an amazing figure. He became a doctor with minimal training, which was the way things were at that time. But he was known as the canoe doctor because he traveled from present-day Whatcom County all the way down to Seattle, Olympia, whenever anybody needed medical help. He was the one that when the night Isaac Eby was murdered, he was the one that they came for, but he was out tending to a patient, and so they moved up the beach to the Eby residence instead. He was a real far-reaching individual. Because of him, Sunnyside Cemetery was formed alongside the original Eby graveyard in the early 1870s.
When he first came here and took a donation claim in 1852, which included all of the ground around Fort Casey, he was not healthy, and he thought that this climate would, maybe make him better. And he decided he was going to be a farmer, that was a healthy life, and maybe he could do better here. Well, the problem was that they didn't have any doctors here, and he was the only doctor, so he was in heavy demand, and so he was gone days at a time. He was afraid of the northern Indians when they came down, so when he built his house, he built it on Smith Prairie, which is miles inland from the water. And he ended up retiring in Seattle, but one thing that he did is that he bought the first addition to this cemetery, and it's called Sunnyside Cemetery Edition. And interestingly, how many doctors own their own cemetery? And also interesting is that he isn't buried in his own cemetery. He's buried on the old original graveyard.
Following the establishment of the Eby graveyard in 1865, Mary Eby Bozarth, the last member of that family, is living up on that hill by herself, and she's incredibly lonely and incredibly missing all of her family. She dies in the early 1870s, and the land passes to her daughter Elmira Enos. Elmira held on to that property until the early 1900s, when a man named Frank Pratt came by, and he was totally taken with the incredible beauty from Sunnyside Farms and persuaded Elmira to sell that land to him.
Frank Pratt was a man of money, and he came here in the early 1900s and bought up hundreds, literally hundreds of acres.
He was a millionaire, even in those days. So during the Depression, he had a yacht. He had a teakwood yacht, I believe it was teakwood, tied up at Good Beach. My dad got to ride on that boat. My dad was Edwin. Got to ride on that boat when he was a teenager, got to go to Seattle. That was a fabulous trip for him. He talked about it for years and years and years.
He bought up all of what we now call Perigo Bluff and Perigo Lake. He bought the ferry house down near Eby's Landing. And he was somewhat of a historian because he protected our history. He protected some of the old structures like the ferry house. He kept roofs on it, and so it wouldn't deteriorate.
He paid for 2 elaborate monuments to mark where the Eby House was and the Sunnyside Farm. After his death in the 1930s, his only son Robert was a key figure in this area. He was a lonely man in terms of he wasn't really engaged with the community on a deep basis, but he cared deeply about this community. Much of it still looks the way it is because he refused to develop his property. And when he died in 1997 and they brought him to Sunnyside for his burial, it was one of the most profound funerals I've ever been to up there, because the family had meant so much to the way this place looks and why.
In 1907, we had a new steamboat built in Coupeville called the Whidbey, and it was spelled without an E, and that's the way Whidbey was spelled in those days. And she was 110 feet long, a beautiful boat. She ran the route between Whidbey Island and Seattle, making several stops, and this was a daily run. And then she'd spend the night in Oak Harbor, where the waters were calm most of the time. Well, in 1911, at night, she caught fire at the dock. And they cut her loose to save the dock, and which they did. And the problem is that there was 2 seamen sleeping aboard, and the berthing quarters were forward underneath the deck, and they didn't get out. So the county buried them here in Sunnyside Cemetery, and they had 2 wood headboards. And wood headboards haven't done very good over the years, but these 2 were saved. They had rotted off, but they were saved, and we assume that was because our first caretaker that started doing some maintenance here, his father was the skipper of the Whidbey the night it burned. So anyway, I always tell the sad story of the 2 seamen because we don't know where they came from. We couldn't notify families, nothing.
With the change in how people viewed death, the way they buried the dead changed as well. Small village cemeteries were replaced by something known as rural cemeteries, or the garden cemetery movement. These were planned burial places outside of town with winding paths and family lots that would hold 10 members of a family, surrounded by ornate fencing, sometimes steps into the plot, and often the family's surname engraved on the stairs as well. And this was adopted by the families here in the community early on, and it's reflected up at Sunnyside. Sunnyside has one of the most eclectic examples of burial in Washington State, anywhere that I've seen.
My mother's side of the family had a Chinaman working for them, and his name was Ah Soot. And he had a shack down on the lower part of the Lucerne farm down in Abyss Prairie. And when he was old, nobody knew how old. He didn't either, but my grandfather took care of him.
My family, the Lucerne family, were a Christian family, and they treated him as part of the family, and he's buried in their lot. And so we're kind of proud of that because he's the only Chinese that's in the cemetery with a marked grave.
The so-called indigents of that time, who were heavily discriminated against, if they were buried in the cemetery, it was usually around the perimeter somewhere. So he was loved by grandchildren and great-grandchildren and all of the children that he could round up. And he used to go into Seattle, which made the merchants unhappy because most of the Chinamen bought from their own people in the city. And he'd bring candy back for all the kids. And my mother can still remember that. And they were loved by the children. But there was a lot of people that didn't love them. They discriminated against them. A lot of the merchants wouldn't hire them. They were able to rent ground, and they raised potatoes and things like that.
Native Americans here, once they adapted to the non-native way of burying their dead, they pretty much kept to themselves. If they did bury them, they would often take them up to the Swinomish Reservation after treaty time in 1855. The last native family to live in this area was Alec and Susie Kettle and their children Elson and Charlie, and they lived here through the 1930s and 1940s. And they're buried up at Sunnyside, but they're buried alongside the fence line, or what was the fence line. The cemetery's expanded west from that point since they were interred there, but that was the place that Indians were allowed to be buried, was along the fence line. There's actually more than a few Native Americans buried up there, but they were never given headstones. And so the only ones that you see when you walk that west fence line is Alec and Susie Kettle and their children. Sunnyside Cemetery is one of the most unique places in Washington State. It's a place that you can track the entire history of this state from pre-contact time, when natives lived here for thousands and thousands of years, to the present day. It holds the stories of immigrants that crossed the Oregon Trail against great odds, of people that emigrated from Ireland to Australia and Tasmania and then ended up here in the 1850s. It's the story of women and how they made it in times when they weren't afforded full rights as women. It's the story of ethnic minorities that struggled and suffered and somehow got by. It's the story of remembrance and commemoration. And what's most remarkable about Sunnyside, I think, is the visual tie it has to this community, where people that live here can look up on that hill every day as they go to the store or to work and see where 4 or 5 generations before them are resting. My very good friend Lillian Huffstetler once wrote an amazing piece about the cemetery because 5 generations before her up there. She said, "I had my start there near Eby's Landing at Aloha Farm, which is where my mother, uncle, brothers, and sisters were born. Eby's Prairie is one of the most beautiful places in the world. My favorite view of it is from Sunnyside Cemetery. The colors of the fields change from season to season, from black soil to greens to golds and tans and browns. Sunnyside Cemetery overlooks the valley, and my family is buried there. Parents, both sets of grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, sisters, and many cousins. I will be there too someday." And last year we took her up there, and she's there with the rest of them, so it's pretty amazing how this place ties to everyday life down here and how the people here tie to that up there on the hill.